Today we're going to be setting some doors. We'll go over single doors and double doors. First, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need. So first off, I've got the 15 and 18 gauge nail guns. Got to have those. A skill saw so we can cut the bottom of the jamb of the door. The oscillator for cutting off shims. I've got an impact, and that's because we're going to be running a screw behind the top hinge because these doors are pretty heavy, so that's going to help keep it from sagging. I've got a drywall saw, and I like to use this to clean off the openings, all the drywall that's hanging in or mud that's on the opening. And then we've got our levels. I've got a couple different sizes. You can set 8-foot doors with a 6-foot level, but I like to use the biggest level that I can fit on the door. So that's why I've got an 8-foot level here, and then I've got a 32-inch, and we're going to use that to level the head jamb. Now, a couple extra tools that are nice to have. One is a ladder. 8-foot doors are pretty tall, so it's hard to reach the top. Door studs are fantastic. You can actually clamp the door in here, roll the door around. It's pretty nice, handy, helps keep from damaging the bottom of the door. You don't have to have them. A couple of things that are also nice to have are air shims. So if this is all you've got, you can do it pretty easily with these. It's easier with the door studs, but these will work. You can shim underneath the door, lift the door up till the hinges are in line, put the hinge pins back in. And then a must-have for me is the mini sledge, because these openings are not always perfect. Sometimes you have to smack them around a little bit, get the studs where you need them to be. And of course you need a bunch of shims, nails for your nail gun, and that's about it. So step one, get the door out of the wrapping. This one's got plastic, cardboard on the sides that are stapled on, and it's got a wooden piece across the bottom, so we're going to knock that off, pull the staples out, so that way when we cut the jamb, we're not cutting through staples. So after I took the bottom brace off, before I stand the door back up, I like to go ahead and put the door studs on. Pretty easy. We just got a locking lever here, slip it on, lock it down, and that's it. Next step is cleaning off the opening. The mudders love to pile their mud on here and hang the sheetrock past, so we're going to go ahead and clean all that off. Next thing to do is to check the opening for plumb. And they don't have to be perfect. This one here isn't too bad. It's about 3/16 out, but I can make that work. One thing I do see is this jack and king stud here are actually twisted. So that's actually making this drywall a little bit wider than it should be, which can give us some problems when we go to case out the door. So what I'm going to try and do is see if I can twist it back a little bit, run a screw in the bottom plate. If you do have to adjust these and you knock the bottom over to get it more plumb and be able to fit your door in there, make sure you come back and run a couple screws into the bottom plate to make sure it doesn't move after you set the door. Before I pull the door off the hinges, I always like to measure from the bottom of the jamb to the bottom of the door. So I've got 7/8. Now I'm shooting for a 5/8 air gap between the bottom of the door and the floor, the finished floor. So I'm going to take a 1/4 inch off of both these jamb legs, and that should give me 5/8 of an inch. So let's go ahead and pop the door off the hinges, and we're going to cut the jamb legs after that. But before I cut that, we set a 1/4 inch off. I'm actually going to stick it in the opening, level the head jamb, and I'm going to see if I need to take any more off than a 1/4 inch either side to get that head perfectly level. This is what I really like about the door studs. I can just pull this out, pop the jamb off, and now I can move my door anywhere I need to. So I've got the jamb sitting directly on the floor. I don't have it up on any spacers or shims yet. So I'm going to take my level and see what I got. I just lift my level up on one side or the other until I get the bubble right in the center. And then I look over and I can tell if that's off of the top of the jamb, a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch. So if this left side is an 1/8 inch up in the air, I know that this right side is an 1/8 inch high. So I'm going to take 3/8 off of the right side and only 1/4 off the left, and that'll get me perfectly plumb on my head jamb. So cutting the jamb legs is pretty simple. All I'm going to do is measure up the 1/4 inch on this side. That's all I need to take off. Take my square, put it right on the mark. What I like to do is I like to hold the jamb up like this and then just cut with my skill saw. So after I cut the jamb legs, I always like to double check it and make sure that I don't need to cut any more off or make any adjustments. And this one looks pretty good. So if your floors are not in yet, you have to figure out what the thickness is and pad the jambs up to that thickness of the floor so that way the flooring can go in underneath it. If the hardwood is already in, then you just go straight to the hardwood or tile. And if you're doing carpet, then you have to figure out how thick that carpet is. We'll go anywhere from 3/8 of an inch off the subfloor to 5/8. I've even done 3/4 before on some really thick carpet. The head jamb is level. Everything's good. We've got everything cleaned off. The bottoms of the jambs are cut. We're ready to install the door. So I like to start with the hinge side. And what I do is I put my level on there and then I check for plumb. Which way is plumb? Which way is it out? So it looks like the bottom has to come out. So what I'm going to do is I always start at the top. I shim above the top hinge first and I bring it out just a little bit off the wall. Now if the top had to come out first, I'm actually going to bring the top of the jamb out just past plumb. So the reason I start with the top hinge is it's easier just to work from top down with that. Now when I check the opening for plumb, if the bottom needs to come out, I will start at the top still and I will shim behind the top hinge and I will just bring it barely off of the stud. And the reason for that is I don't want the jamb getting bound just above the hinge when I bring out the bottom of the jamb. So the top of the jamb, if I'm completely against the stud and I bring the bottom out, well, I'm shimming down here. So the top of the jamb will actually be pushing into the stud. I don't want that. I want a little bit of wiggle room on the head so I can adjust the head of the jamb after I get the hinge side nailed off. Now, if I have to set the door and I'm pulling the top of the jamb off and the jamb needs to come out, I'm not going to pull the top of the jamb out till it's perfectly plumb. I'm going to go a little bit more than that, so that way as I plumb down the line, when I pull the bottom of the jamb off, I will be about 1/8 inch, just slightly off of the stud. And that's going to help give me some wiggle room for some adjustment later, because if I go perfectly plumb and then I'm working my way down the jamb, well, I might get to the bottom and be like, you know what, I needed an extra 1/16. Now I have to redo all of those shims just to get that extra 1/16. So when the top needs to come out, I pull it out just a little bit past plumb, and then I work my way down from there. So now that it is shimmed off of this stud, just about 1/8 inch, because the bottom has to come out more. Remove my level, pop a couple nails in it. This is where I will put my level on the back side or the front side of the jamb, and I will check the jamb back and forth instead of side to side. And that's because sometimes these walls are not plumb, and they're probably never gonna be plumb, but I will fudge this door back and forth so that way both of my jamb legs are in plane with each other and the door closes nicely. So this is telling me that the top of this has to go back about 1/16 and the bottom has to come out about another 1/16, which is not bad. So I'll just tap that back a little bit, and that one is fine. Now I'm going to move on. I'm going to put my level back and I'm going to go down to the bottom hinge and shim that one out. So now I'm on the bottom side. I'm actually going to shim right behind this back hinge here. And I'm going to add shims until I get my bubble perfectly in the center. Okay, so I've got it plumb that way. I'm going to take my level and I double check for plumb the other way, and that looks pretty good. So I'm just going to pop one nail in it. Now I'm not worried about shimming the back side of this jamb. I'm going to do that later. And now that I have a shim above the top hinge and one directly behind the bottom hinge, put my level back on. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to shim these next two hinges, and it's pretty simple. All I have to do is put a shim in there and push the shim in until it touches the level. Now you got to be careful that you don't go too far, because then the level will come off the bottom hinge and, well, then you have a crooked door. So I just tap that one in and I come above this middle hinge here, do the same thing, just till it touches. Then I'll pop a nail in both of these. Now one thing to watch out for on the hinges is sometimes these screws aren't in perfectly straight, so the edge will be kicked out, or these hinges will not be mortised in fully. So that will actually throw off your jamb a little bit. So sometimes we have to remortise these hinges a little bit or reset the screw. So one trick as you are putting your first shims in above the top hinge is I shim the front and the back. Now I will adjust these shims and I'll put more in the back side or more in the front side according to my head jamb. So if the jamb on the strike side is way behind the drywall here, I'll shim more on the back side. That'll square it up and bring it forward. And then same thing, if it's too far past the drywall, I'll add more shim to the front or less shim to the back and get that jamb squared up. And that's going to help me plumb these legs later when I do the back side and I shim that. So now that the shims at the top are in and I've got shims on the hinge side, I'm going to add a few shims to the back side of this jamb. And it's pretty simple. Since I ran my shims in to get this in line with the doorway, I can take my level, start at the top, and I'll go down to the bottom and get it in plumb. So the bottom's got to come out a little bit, so I will shim the back side of this. So now since my top of the jamb is square with the opening, now I've plumbed down from the top to the bottom. Now I know the bottom of my jamb is also square with the opening. And then same thing as the front. I'm going to go back, I'm going to take shims, and I'm just going to fill in the spots and just push that jamb out till it touches the level. Now once that's done, I'm just going to pop a few nails in this side and then I'll hang the door. So if you can see, I've actually got a little bit of a rock in this door, and that's because this jamb is bowed out right here. Now I've been trying to fight that, and it's just this section right here that's bowed out. And instead of trying to fight that and getting everything off, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my nail gun, pop a nail in it so it sucks it back a little bit. Now I can put my level on there and shim everything to exactly where it needs to be. And if that nail drove this in a little bit too far, that's fine. I can come back later and shim that and bring that back out to where it needs to be. So now I've got the hinge side plumb, and I'm just going to bring in the door, adjust the door stud until the hinges line up, and then I'm going to set the door and put the pins back in it. And this is why I like using the door stud, because I can just roll it on up here, get that lined up, stick in my first hinge pin, and work my way down. And now the bottom doesn't line up, which is fine, because all I have to do is turn down these. It's actually going to roll right in there. So as you're rehanging the door and putting the hinge pins in, sometimes these hinges don't always line up perfectly. So I will actually take my mallet and I will smack the hinge either on the door or the jamb up or down just till they line up and they slide in place. So the door's hanging. Now I'm just going to pop off the door studs. So now we have the door swinging, and what I'm going to do is close the door, and I'm going to check my reveal at the top, and that's going to tell me if I need to move this head jamb back or forth. And that's why I always shim the jamb off of the stud just a little bit to give me that wiggle room. And I can tell that I have a bigger reveal between the jamb and the slab of the door on this side than I do over here. So I'm actually going to put some shims in at the top of the head jamb to push this over just a little bit. Now the ideal reveal that we're looking for is anywhere from 3/32 to 1/8 inch of a gap. Now you want to go a little bit bigger of a gap if you're in an unconditioned space, if the doors are still going to be painted yet. And if the doors are painted, or if you're in an air-conditioned space and the doors are acclimated and they're nice doors, you can go ahead and go with that 3/32 gap, and that's going to give you a really nice clean reveal. So I will just put one shim over on this side, and I will drive it in until I get the reveal I'm looking for. It's about perfect. Then I will also check the top reveal on both of these corners and make sure they're the same, make sure everything still looks good and that nothing got off as I was setting the door. So now once I have my head jamb reveal good, I'm going to take some shims and I'm going to put a couple shims in on this side at the top of the jamb there. I'll come down a couple inches usually. So I've got some shims in there, double check the reveal, it's still good. So I'm actually going to swing the door open and put a nail through those shims. On the hinge side of the jamb, I checked that for plumb both ways, front and back. And I'm kind of going to do the same thing here. I'm not just going to adjust the reveal. I'm going to look for the jamb back and forth. I'm going to close the door till the top of the door hits the door stop. And I'm going to look down at the bottom and I'm going to kind of pull that jamb in until it hits the door stop on the bottom of the door. Now I can see that I am about a 1/4 inch in past the drywall on the bottom of the door. So I'm going to knock out the top of the jamb an 1/8 inch past the drywall at the top. So that's going to give me an 1/8 inch at the bottom and the top. It's kind of split the difference, and I can hide the rest of that with casing because, like I said, walls aren't perfect. They're never going to be. We have to do what we can to make it look good. And we also don't want the door to ghost. And by ghost, if you have your jamb way out of plumb, this door is going to open by itself or close by itself, depending on which way it goes. And we don't want that to happen. So we do the best that we can. I try not to go an 1/8 inch past the drywall in any way, which way that I can. If this was worse and it was more than an 1/8, I would actually go back to the hinge side and I would start knocking in or out the top or bottom. And that gives me 4 points to kind of control where the jamb legs go, so that way I can get it in the opening. I don't have too much sticking out or behind the drywall on any which corner, and the door will still close nice, and I'll have a good reveal, good flush door to jamb reveal on the face here. So I'll knock this out. I only have one nail in it, so it'll move pretty easy. And now to keep it from moving, I'm going to add one more nail. I'll close the door again and push in till I'm hitting the door stop up there and pull the jamb out till I'm hitting the door stop down here. And that looks pretty good. I can work with that. So now what I personally like to do is come down to the strike and I go right above the strike. Yeah, put a shim in there and then I match my reveal from the top down to the strike. Try to hold the jamb in place. And I'll pop a nail through that. Now the door seems to be closing pretty good. So same thing as the hinge side, I'm actually going to shim the front side of this, and then once that's done, I can go back with a straight edge and get the back side nice and straight. Now that that shim is nailed, I'm going to move up. It's an 8-foot door, so I'm going to put 2 more shims in right here, and then I will move down to the bottom of the door, shim that. I'll get my reveal pretty good, and then I will nail that off, and we'll transfer to the back side. So I've been having the same problems on this jamb, is the jamb is actually kind of bowed in. So what I'll do is I'll just pop a nail in there and then I'll bring the jamb back over to where it needs to be with shims. You can use a 15 gauge or an 18 gauge. I like to use an 18 gauge with some 2-inch nails because it leaves a smaller hole and it's pretty easy to pull it back out to where it needs to go. So I got the front side shimmed. My reveal looks pretty good. So now I'm going to do the same thing as I did on the hinge side. I'm going to take my level, and I know the head jamb is in line with the wall, so it should be squared up with the wall. And I'll put my level on there, and I will plumb down. I'll start at the bottom and then fill in between as needed. So now that I have both sides pretty well shimmed and nailed off, I'm actually going to go around and fine tune everything. I had a little bit of a tight spot right here in this jamb. So All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a nail right in here. Check that. And it looks like it sucked it over pretty good. You know, I've got another spot up here that's a little bit big, so I'm just gonna add a shim in right there and see if I can get that a little bit tighter so the reveal looks good. That looks pretty good. And then I've got a pretty big space below the strike, and that's kind of bowed out, so I'm gonna add a shim or two down there just to get the reveal right. The thing about these reveals and shimming the doors is you want to shim as much as needed, but as little as possible. So you don't want to fill the whole thing with shims, but you also don't want so few shims to where the jamb's going all over the place. It's going to make it real hard to get your casing on, and it's not going to look right. Then I'll do it the same to the hinge side. I will actually go in between the hinges. If there's a big space, I'm going to add a shim in here, and I'm going to bring that jamb over, because I also want reveals looking real good on the hinge side, not just the strike side on the top. So I've got all the reveals looking pretty good. Now I want to finish shimming in spots that I like extra shims. So I'm going to go below the hinge, the top hinge. I like to shim above and below the top hinge, above the middle hinge, below the middle hinge, and right behind the bottom hinge. Because these doors are so heavy, if you try and shim below that bottom hinge, it's actually going to push that jamb in, and it's going to start sagging, and it's not going to look too well. So I'm going to add another one below the top hinge, and I will also add another shim below the strike. And I like it above and below the strike, and the reason for that is because this takes a lot of abuse, and so does that top hinge. So we like extra shims there, extra nails, and that's going to help hold the door in place, and we won't have any problems later. Let's take a look at the nailing pattern we're using. I'm going more towards the outside of the jamb rather than right next to the doorstop. That's going to help keep the jamb from twisting out, and that just gives us more surface area to hold the jamb in place. If you go inside, the jamb could rock a lot easier, and your shims will start moving and falling out. Clearly we don't want that. So I like to go towards the outside and then angle them in, because one, when you angle them inwards, it's going to help hold a little bit better, and two, we want to make sure we get plenty of meat on that 2x4 when we nail it. Now before I'm finished, I like to come back and I like to add a couple more nails to like the top hinge, bottom hinge, and the strike. That's just going to help hold the door in place and make sure it doesn't move. And these don't have to be on the outside pointing in. I'll put these sometimes right on the doorstop. And that just gives it a little bit more security. Make sure the door, after years of opening and closing, being slammed, it doesn't move back and forth. The door is set, the reveals look pretty good. So now we're going to cut off the shims, and then we're going to do one last thing, which is adjust the doorstop. So the only thing we have left to do is adjust the doorstop. Now, as you can tell, the door hits the bottom, but not quite the top. And these door stops aren't always perfect, so we can also use these to adjust a little bit if our jamb legs are a little bit out and we need just a little bit more. And we don't want to go too far with this, because then the jamb is going to be sticking way past the door or way inside the door on the outside. So we want to use this at a very small amount. So the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check this. Looks like just the bottom's hitting. So I'm actually going to take just a little block of wood and I'm going to tap that in until it's flush with the rest of the doorstop. We've got it pretty well set. It makes a solid sound as you close the door. That's what you want to hear. So the other thing I'm going to check is the hinge side of the doorstop. I do not want this doorstop touching the slab of the door. I want it about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch off of the door slab. And the reason for that is after they paint this, they're going to add a little bit of thickness to it. And when you close the door is actually going to rub on the doorstop as it closes. Then you're going to get a squeak. Most people think it's a hinge. It's actually the doorstop, or your door will actually act like it's hinge bound. It won't be hinge bound, but it will act like it because it's kind of bouncing off of the doorstop. Another thing to watch out for is the top of the doorstop. Sometimes it's bowed in towards the door. So you go to close the door and it's actually the top of that doorstop pushing the door open. So once again, you think it's hinge bound. It's actually not, it's the doorstop. So I like to have about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch gap between this door stop and the door slab. And then from the top, I go from that reveal to nothing to the other side, and then tight all the way down the strike side. Now once the door stop is all in place, I will come back with an 18 gauge and I will re-nail the door stop so it doesn't move. Sometimes you have to kind of pull it into place and nail it to get it to stay, because it's just a thin piece of wood, and sometimes they've got bows in them, they don't want to stay after you hit them, so you might have to pull it, nail it, and then check it. So that's it for setting a single door. Now we're going to take a look at double doors.